Every auteur has at least one masterpiece that perfectly encapsulates the director's abilities to their full potential. For John Woo, his final Hong Kong film would become his magnum opus, as well as one of the greatest action films of all time. Hello, I'm Peter Garrett, and this is the Criterion Chronicle. Welcome to the Criterion Chronicle. I'm your host, Peter Garrett. The Criterion Chronicle is the chronological journey through the Criterion collection, starting from DVD Spine number 1. As we move along in our cinematic travels, we reach Criterion Spine number 9, John Woo's epic crime masterpiece, Hard Boiled. Now, Hard Boiled focuses on two Hong Kong policemen, Tequila and Tony, who are both attempting to take down a notorious and ruthless crime lord, but in very different ways. So this episode actually is a first, because this episode marks the first instance where multiple films from the same director are appearing in the collection consecutively. So this will happen multiple times throughout the collection, where there's 2, 3, 4 plus films, sometimes whole box sets of directors. But this is going to be the first of me covering 2 films from the same director back to back. So and because of that, it'll make actually comparing these 2 films much easier, as well as serve, I think, as a larger snapshot of this particular director's work. So you'll be able to watch both of these episodes and kind of get a nice bigger picture of John Woo. So, and I think because the killer directly precedes Hard Boiled in the collection, it gives us this clear progression of Woo's trajectory as a filmmaker. Because as I said in the opening, I believe every auteur has at least one film that represents the director's abilities in their top signature form. So, and I after doing the research and looking into different auteurs and different peaks and everything, I basically came up with a theory where I believe there are 3 main categories of the types of peaks that an auteur can reach. So the first is the lone masterpiece, where they basically pretty much just have that one perfect film, whether that was at the beginning, middle, or end of their careers. So this would include Orson Welles' Citizen Kane, although obviously, granted, some people might include The Magnificent Ambersons as well as a masterpiece, but Kane is the one that stands out and kind of it's not argued. It's the undisputed masterpiece. It's considered one of the greatest films ever made. But really, and he had some really other interesting films. He has a lot of other interesting films in Criterion. But Citizen Kane is kind of where he got to do his full artistic vision is there. So, and it still blows my mind that Kane was Welles' directorial debut at 26. So that would be the first example. Another example would be Charles Laughton's The Night of the Hunter with Robert Mitchum. So, which the sad thing about that is that was the only film he ever directed. So it's kind of like he has a perfect record almost as a director, because he had one incredible masterpiece of a film, and then that's it. So, a lot of people often have a big what if, what could he have done had he directed more films? But unfortunately, we'll never know. So, but Night of the Hunter is a wonderful film. So that would go in there. And then also I would say Jacques Tati's Playtime. So now, granted, I'm a huge Tati fan. So Jacques Tati is actually one of my favorite French directors. And, I love all of his films. And I think all of his films are terrific. But the reason why I say Playtime is his kind of standalone masterpiece is because it's just on a completely different level than everything else. It's on a scale that's bigger than he ever did, and it just works in a way that is just beautiful. So then you have that one, and then finally I would say Michael Cimino's The Deer Hunter. So, and that was another thing where he had a great debut with Thunderbolt and Lightfoot with Clint Eastwood and Jeff Bridges, and then Deer Hunter was obviously a masterpiece, won Best Picture at the Oscars. But sadly though, his follow-up was a movie called Heaven's Gate, which ended up being an incredibly huge box office bomb. And because it was such a big bomb, it's credited as being one of the films that effectively kind of ended the new Hollywood era that started in the 70s that was director focused, and it changed into the more producer focused commercial blockbuster era of the 80s. So the second category that I would say are the directors that have their short streaks where they hit their stride and produce a string of maybe like 2 to 4 incredible films. So I would say this would include David Lean, who, although some dispute and argue whether he was a true auteur or not. So, as well as Nicholas Ray, Sam Peckinpah, and Robert Bresson. So, and then the final category I would be the directors who just kind of have this sustained longevity with their brilliance, where once they reach their peaks, they don't fall off. They just kind of stay at this high level. Some kind of go up, they peak and they can stay up there for a while, and then maybe they'll start to go back down a little bit after they hit that. But for the most part, they have this kind of sustained brilliance through most of it. And that would include Alfred Hitchcock, Akira Kurosawa, Stanley Kubrick, John Ford, Jean-Pierre Melville, Yasujiro Ozu, and Andrei Tarkovsky. So, and now granted, I made a decision. I made a point to only include directors in these categories for the sake of this video who are no longer alive, because their careers are complete. There can't be more films. And I think because I felt that to include living directors might be kind of closing the book on their directorial careers maybe too soon, because they're still active and they could potentially create maybe one or two more, or and so I feel like you can't really judge that their careers in that way. And I guess maybe there's a potential fourth category of somebody who hits a masterpiece early on and then has nothing, or it just drops for a while and then hits another one very maybe a lot later in their career. So but I will say though that there is something that's very special and rewarding to see a director's vision be flawlessly executed. So, to see what they were capable of under all of the ideal and right circumstances. Because the truth is, for directors, that aren't able, that directors aren't able to maintain that high level of output because of a few different reasons that sometimes isn't necessarily their fault. So the first reason would be maybe limited creative ability or impulses that can basically lead to diminishing returns. That is, a director has a few kind of trademark things that they do, and when they first come out, those are very new and exciting and novel. But because that's really the only kind of I want to say the only tricks in their arsenal, as it were, then eventually it becomes like, okay, yeah, we've seen this, and it doesn't really bring anything new to the table anymore. So they don't have the freshness anymore that they used to have. And then the next one, I would say there would be a lack of financial or technical resources that they can use for their vision. So obviously that comes to whether or not their films will get financed and produced by production companies or studios that have the money to give them what they want to produce. So oftentimes you'll have directors that will, for a certain time, while they're riding high, they'll get basically blank checks from studios. And then, but unfortunately, if their results start to decline, then that's not to say that the films themselves go down. They can make masterpieces, but the masterpieces just might not make money. And at that point, they might lose that confidence from the studios, and in which case they also lose their financing, which makes it harder for them to be able to make the movies that they want to make. The next reason would be, say, changing audience preferences that can leave them stranded. So just audiences can just move on from them and just feel like, you know what, this isn't really the kind of movies that we want to see anymore. And that's a possibility. The change in taste and the way the market shifts, and how different, like, for instance, different genres of movies, whether they're westerns, whether they're musicals, whether they're, I want to say, the kind of action film, an action film like Hard Boiled that used to be really popular, are no longer, kind of go out of fashion. And then all of a sudden it's like, yeah, well, they're not motivated to make them anymore. Or in the case, obviously, of some of the singular peak examples, they just have that one film where just everything comes together in the right way. So, and I would say where John Woo fits into the conversation is still up for debate, but I would say he's got at least three films that are indisputable masterpieces, which are The Killer, Bullet in the Head, which he made in between, and Hard Boiled. So now some people might try to argue for for A Better Tomorrow and A Better Tomorrow 2, which I can understand. I mean, those are both great films, and they actually, those were, the first film started the whole heroic bloodshed renaissance in Hong Kong, but they were much smaller, and they were less ambitious films than The Killer and Bullet in the Head and Hard Boiled. And while I think that The Killer and Bullet in the Head are both top tier Woo films, I think it's Hard Boiled that was the biggest film of his Hong Kong era. So because I believe that Hard Boiled is the pinnacle of the specific kind of action that John Woo pioneered. So very few filmmakers can claim to have invented a specific subgenre of film, but John Woo is one such person. And he is the inventor of what is known as gun fu. So, and I touched on this briefly in my previous episode on The Killer, but I was saving it to go into more detail for this episode. But Woo actually started directing in the 70s, and he started by making basically traditional martial arts films. While these films helped establish Woo in the Hong Kong film world, he wouldn't truly break out as a name director until the 1980s with the advent of gun fu. So gun fu is a type of stylized action that applies dance-like choreography and spectacle to gunfights, which gives them a more dramatic and operatic feel to them. So, and because of the highly stylized nature of gun fu, it's deliberately not meant to be realistic, but theatrical. So, and I feel like it's important to remember that, because people will, sometimes can be caught up in Woo's lack of realism, thinking that the action sequences are just too fanciful and ridiculous to some people. But gun fu is knowingly unrealistic and over the top in certain ways. So the first aspect to gun fu is its ballet-like choreography, which includes characters doing spectacular and extraordinary moves while shooting. the way that the scenes were choreographed, every move had has a specific, again, like dance, like ballet, there is a reason for it to be there. So, and specific types of moves that would occur would include dives, rolls, spins, slides, and jumps. In every major action sequence in Hard Boiled, at least one character will do a dramatic move. So in the beginning, in the tea house shootout, Tequila, runs on top of tables as people are shooting at him, as well as he runs and slides into the back room towards the end of the scene to get the last guy who's there. In the warehouse sequence, when there's a point when Tequila jumps in the air and he fires the shotgun midair at a motorcycle coming at him, and the motorcycle explodes in a big fireball. And then at the beginning of the hospital shootout, at the end, you have Tequila and Tony sliding out of the morgue cabinets, basically as they're coming into the fight. So all these moves are again really well choreographed and placed, and again meant to be more meant to make it more exciting. So and then one of the most recognizable tropes of gun fu is how a lot of characters will fire two guns at the same time. So that's something that, for instance, we saw a lot of in The Killer specifically. Where John in that film is in pretty much every action sequence, he has two guns shooting at people. So, but in Hard Boiled, this happens. It actually doesn't happen as much, I think, in this one, because more of the characters have like shotguns and machine guns in this instead of just using handguns. But it does happen a few times. So like Tequila does this throughout the entire tea house sequence. As well as, during a good portion of the hospital shootout, Tony is doing this as they're going through the hallways. So, and then the next core element to gun fu, I would say, is the heavy use of slow motion as a way to make action look, more poetic and beautiful instead of just violent. So, and also John Woo said that he used slow motion not just for the action, but for the emotion. But then I also believe that I think the slow motion allows us to savor the action sequences more as well. It gives them more time to breathe, which can be in contrast to many other action scenes that tend to feel, too rushed or anticlimactic sometimes. So, because, when you watch films like, for instance, like the Bourne movies, the action is happening, super fast and the editing is super quick, and it can just be like, and I mean, I know a lot of people like that, and it's really cool, and it can be really exciting to watch. But again, sometimes it can make the action a little difficult to follow, and I feel like you can't appreciate as much sometimes of what's going on, like the stunt work that's happening. So like when we see some of these characters do these stunts in slow motion, and you think to yourself, wow, that's really incredible that these people are doing this stuff that in that way. So like during, and so I'd say probably one of the most iconic examples of this in the film is during the tea house shootout, when Tequila he's chasing a bad guy down some stairs, and he's in the process of trying to, shoot the guy. And then because there's somebody on the stairs, that he gets kind of pushed to the side. And what happens is he basically leans on the railing and then starts shooting this, as he's going down this way, as he, so he's going down the stairs, shooting the guns at an angle, and it's an amazing looking shot. Like, that's one of those moments where you watch the movie and you just think to yourself, this guy is an awesome character. That's an awesome introduction to a character. And that's another thing that Wu did really well was creating these larger than life characters. And I'll talk about more about that later. But again, that hit the shot of Tequila going down the stairs is probably the most recognizable. I mean, it's on the DVD cover. That's the shot of him. So and because the whole thing just looks so cool. The way that it was filmed and edited. Like, that's the thing. That's what you want from an action movie. You want an action movie to, when you watch it, for you to be like, that's awesome. That it makes you think, I want to be that guy. I want to be doing that stuff. I want to be doing the cool stuff I'm watching. So there's that. And then obviously there's multiple. And the thing is, I can't mention all the slow mo because he uses slow motion so much throughout the film, especially in all the big sequences, that I can't really talk about all of them, unfortunately. But again, as I said, the slow motion moments are also there for the emotional beats. This happens typically when a character gets shot. So for instance, when Tequila's partner in the beginning gets killed at the tea house, he's, it shows him, getting hit with multiple bullets and him, falling back. And that's obviously a big emotional moment because it's not just a man getting shot, but it's Tequila's partner. And then also when Wong's men are in the warehouse shootout, in the warehouse scene, when Wong's men are getting are mowing down all of Uncle Hoy's guys at the warehouse, as well as when Tony, in return, basically shoots all of the, pretty much all of Uncle Hoy's guys after, in that confrontation. But they're, and then, and then I'd say one of the most emotional example, or the starkest example of using it emotionally, is during the hospital shootout when Johnny Wong guns down when Johnny Wong guns down the patients that are there and trying to leave. And that's just, again, that's a very emotional moment. And then also at the very end where when you have Tequila, he jumps out of the window with the baby as the hospital is exploding. So those are big. Those are obviously big moments, physically as well as emotionally. So, and now I'd say the third main component to Gun Fu is Wu's use of visual flair, which includes things like billowing smoke, flying glass, large sparks, his signature doves, or maybe other birds that he has, and dramatic lighting. So, because again, I think that this creates more of a wow factor when watching the action in a way that pyrotechnics tend to do during concerts or other live events. So, and in the like for instance in the tea house, there are things like cups and other items that they get blasted into the air as the characters are shooting, as well as like there's a moment where glass signs are exploding, and then we also see small pieces of paper exploding, like whether, I don't know if they're napkins or just there for the sake of adding more visual flair, but they're basically exploding like confetti around all the characters. And then during the warehouse battle, we see multiple cars erupt into giant plumes of sparks and small explosions as characters are shooting at each other. I mean, like especially when Tequila is shooting the shotgun at people. I mean, and then pretty much almost every shotgun blast in the hospital battle produces a small explosion. So, which again is, as I said, that's not meant to be really, that doesn't happen when you shoot a shotgun. It doesn't cause these explosions with everything, like with giant sparks and and little fireballs and stuff like that. Uh, but uh, but then and then you also have, many instances of characters that are dramatically falling through things like windows or on top of cars or over railings. So, so again, it's all meant to be part of, all of that is meant to, just like the moves that the characters are doing. That was, it's all meant to be way more visually just, way more visually dynamic than, say, regular action films. And then the final aspect to Gun Fu is the operatic tone it brings to the action. So, think of it as like an orchestra. During a symphony or an opera, there are specific musical moments that show a clear progression, like an allegro or an aria. And, oftentimes, you can hear the music just becoming bigger and bigger, leading to that, that big final crescendo of the symphony or the piece that they're playing. And Wu uses that framework to have action sequences build and build to either usually an emotional or a thematic climax. So, and I would say this is most notable for pretty much for the entire hospital scene, which I think it personally is one of the most spectacular action sequences ever filmed. So, now Gun Fu would later be replicated in Hollywood in such films as Desperado, The Matrix, Equilibrium. So, and again, how I talked, and this is, when I talked about this in the Killer episode, how again, Wu was just incredibly influential as a filmmaker. But you see these films, they don't quite hit it the same way. The Gun Fu doesn't go as I think, as raw as I think Wu was able to do it. I mean, because you can feel, it's like you can feel the bullets. It's like when you're watching the movie, I feel like, with every gunshot, because they're booming, it's almost like you can feel it in your chest every time a character fires. So I just think that makes it, way more visceral when you're watching it compared to films that would come later that were, more, the Hollywood films that were, a little more polished and glossy compared to how Wu did it. Because, Wu's characters, they're sweating, they're bleeding, they don't look very glamorous for the most part. So the Gun Fu, I think, it's interesting because I think the Gun Fu is meant to be a more beautiful representation of what's going on. And again, that ties back into the idea of making the action more beautiful looking, that, juxtaposed to how brutal it is. It's like, how can something so beautiful also be so violent? So I think that's one of the interesting contrasts of Gun Fu. So now, and while Gun Fu provides the incredible spectacle of Hard Boiled, I think the film's core dilemma serves as the heart of the film. So the central conflict and theme of the film focuses basically on the nature of, the lengths that Tequila and Tony are willing to push themselves in order to do their jobs, which is either to arrest or, if necessary, take out the film's main villain, Johnny Wong. So, what makes this conflict so interesting to me, say compared to The Killer, is how both lead characters are police officers, as opposed to in The Killer, where one is a criminal, he's the hitman, and then the other one is a police officer. So, because we get the two people that are basically on the same side, but we get we get a different sense of duty and obsession from these two guys. So, and that's what makes, I think, the theme so wonderfully laid out, is because we don't get it just in one perspective. We get two perspectives of this. And, we see both Tequila and Tony being pushed to the edge of their limits as police officers and having to stay within the bounds of the law. Or at least as we think it should be, because there's actually a lot of things, and I'll mention this a little later with Tony's character. There's a lot of things he does where you're like, I don't know if he could actually still be a cop after this, because he's done a lot of stuff where I don't even know if being undercover gives him that get out of jail free card, as it were. So, but the film highlights, kind of the very narrow line that there is between a cop and a criminal, because I think both Tequila and Tony skirt that line throughout the film. So, I would say, because in the opening tea house shootout, basically, Tequila basically executes the man who killed his partner when he could have arrested him. So the guy, he shoots, he shoots, the guy shoots his partner, and then Tequila just goes and shoots him in the head. No questions, no hesitation, does it. And you think to yourself, well, okay. I mean, it's one thing if he does it when he's getting fired at. It's another thing when he basically has the guy, he's got the drop on the guy. He's got the guy where he can't do anything, and still shoots him. So you're just like, okay, all right. That's that, and that scene brings up the dilemma of, should a police officer use deadly force to punish a criminal or not? And that actually kind of introduces the fact that Tequila is he's the hard-boiled cop of the film. He's hot-headed, he's impulsive, sometimes he might act without thinking. And shows that, that he's got a willingness to go beyond the limits of what he's supposed to do and allowed to do as a cop. And I believe his obsession is exemplified by the multiple times he essentially acts out on his own with seemingly, no approval or permission from his boss. There's a point when he confronts the character Johnny Wong on the street, and he does this by, he covers Wong's cars, the windows of the cars with newspapers showing about the with articles talking about, I think it's about police, either police coming down on crime or other things that are meant to kind of send Johnny Wong this message. And then once Wong starts to rip them off, he basically, Tequila just, comes up, puts him down on the hood of the car, pulls a gun on him, and is like, you better watch out, because he's like, if you do anything wrong, I'm gonna get you, and basically threatens him to his face. Again, something I really don't think a police officer is allowed to do, but again, for the sake of the film and for dramatic tension, it works terrifically. And Chow Yun-fat, who plays Tequila, he does it obviously with his stature and bravado and everything. So, and then another time when we see Tequila basically acting on his own is when he decides to become this one-man army and drops in on the warehouse, leading to this massive firefight. So, he throws a bunch of I want to say smoke grenades, and then he just drops in on a line and then just starts shooting everybody. So, and it's this, it's an incredible scene. And again, the amazing thing about the action in the film is it is over the top, it is unrealistic, it is fantastical, but it doesn't you're not laughing at it. There's a lot of times when you'll see movies that do these kind of over the top action sequences and you'll laugh at yourself because you're like, this is ridiculous. But John Woo actually it doesn't happen with him. So, and that's something that I really love about him. So, and then, and, also going to the fact, playing into Tequila's hot-headedness is one of the key elements of his storyline, which is the fact that he's always in contention with his superior, Superintendent Pang. So, right from the beginning, after the tea house, Pang berates Tequila for basically because the guy he killed was an undercover police officer who he was using to be used as a witness later on. But even though that officer killed Tequila's partner first. So, which I almost want to say, like, you see that scene and he tells him that was my guy. And you almost want to be like, Tequila should be like, well, that guy killed my partner. So what do you want me to do? He killed a cop first. But Pang, he offers no condolences or sympathy towards Tequila about his dead partner, who he basically he's standing over his partner's body, yelling at Tequila, not even acknowledging it. So, and then there's a point where Pang tells Tequila to back off the arms dealing investigation, but Tequila refuses and he continues to investigate it anyway. And then at one point, Tequila confronts Pang about Tony being a cop. And he even tells Pang to make sure he knows who the cops and the criminals are. So again, also kind of playing into this whole, the whole theme of, or at least I think one of the themes is the nature of like, or again, the line between being a cop and a criminal. Because again, it plays with that. It blurs those lines a lot in the film at times. So, and then also, and then when Tony is introduced, he walks into the library and he just shoots a man in the head. Basically, now granted, at that moment, we don't know he's a cop and that the man he killed was a criminal. But the fact that he does this as part of his undercover identity makes it just, again, kind of a real world, kind of highly debatable action in the context of what undercover police officers are allowed to do. And then throughout the film, Tony has to commit acts that threaten to compromise not only his cover, but, erode his soul as well. So, he's tasked with being the one to kill his former employer, Hoy, when Wong sets him up at the warehouse. And then, as well as I said earlier, when he basically, after he shoots Hoy, he basically, kills all of his guys too. But then at one point, Tony also attempts to protect a police informant named Foxy by shooting him. So that's another way that the film, again, blurs this line, because we see Tony initially as a criminal, and then obviously when we find out he's a police officer about, around like kind of halfway through it, it's like, oh, okay. But then you're like, but wait, he did all this stuff. And like the superintendent Pang knows about this stuff. And that's like, okay. He's okay to do that. But I will say this, we never see Tony like getting seduced or enjoying playing the role of a gangster. So we see that he's very conflicted and that it's taking a toll on him. Especially as it goes on longer and longer through the film. It weighs more on him. And that actually, to me, that's another major thematic element of the film, is how the job just deeply affects both of these men. So, Tequila has such an obsession for his job, that it's cost him relationships, most notably with Teresa, who she's the lead female character of the film. And And the thing that's interesting about Teresa, real quick, and I'll talk about her for a minute or two, is because in The Killer, the romantic the romantic relationship is the central relationship of the film. And again, and I said how that's what made The Killer stand out from a lot of Wu's other films, which are a lot more male bonding focused compared to everything else. But I will say Teresa is she is a solid character in this. I mean, granted, she's not like Jenny was, because Jenny was obviously more this innocent kind of, again, she was more in need of protection, whereas Teresa she is also a police officer, and she's actually involved with what Tony's doing, because Tony sends her flowers. She accepts the flowers, which with notes on them that basically have song lyrics on them that are meant to denote a code that is used to translate to give messages to Superintendent Pang. So but yeah, and then also like Teresa gets she gets some really good moments in there, where, especially in the hospital scene, where she's pretty integral to what's going on there. So she's like she's Tequila calls her to get there, but she's the one who basically initiates the evacuation of the hospital. She's the one who becomes very determined to especially get the babies, because there's a lot of babies in the maternity ward that need to get evacuated. So she takes the responsibility of saving all the babies. And then she even gets a moment where she gets to shoot one of the bad guys. So she's probably Wu's most active female character in that heroic bloodshed gun fu era of his. So but back to Tequila, the fact that Tequila, he's always at odds with Pang, and Tequila, because Tequila just tends to be a bull in a china shop with everybody around him, which is a high contrast to Tony, and I mean, like it's interesting, so it's interesting because, again, that Wu made these two characters so different from each other, because Tony tends to get along with and have good relationships with everyone, even when he's interacting with the criminals he's supposed to be working against. So when we see him first meeting with Uncle Hoy, like he shows up at Uncle Hoy's compound or house or wherever, and everybody's like being like, "Hey man, what's going on?" And they're all like kind of play fighting and ribbing him, and he's just like, "Hey Tony," or he's called Alan at that point. They know him as Alan, but and then he's palling around with all of them, and then even with Superintendent Pang, he's got a much better relationship with Pang. Like Pang actually cares what happens to Tony, and he doesn't really care what happens to Tequila. So Pang is so Tony, again, he's this, like, he's much cooler headed in a lot of ways, and again, he tends to be a more likable person overall. But Tony finds having to live a double life is incredibly exhausting and debilitating, to the point where he doesn't know who he is anymore sometimes. And like there's a scene where he even forgets his own birthday, and he has to be reminded by Pang when Pang gives him a gift, which is a little lighter that he has. But it's just something where Tony, and we don't know how long he's been undercover. Maybe it's a few months. I think it's a few months. I don't think it's longer than that. But but again, but as I said before, Tony's done things where it's difficult to see how he could remain a police officer. So like after he whether it's, killing Hoy's men, and because the thing is Johnny, Wong actually gives Tony a choice whether or not to kill Hoy and his men. So now, granted, it's kind of like a no-win situation. I think we're meant to believe that if he doesn't do it and Wong has to, then maybe Tony will get killed too, because maybe Wong will think Tony's not strong enough or reliable enough to do it. But Tony he has to make a conscious decision to do it. And he does. So, because again, I guess he could refuse and he could sacrifice himself to save these, in his eyes, maybe to save it. But then again, if he does, the guys get killed anyway, and then he gets killed. So it would be him throwing his life away, mainly just to maybe uphold a principle of his, which I guess you could argue that's still like maybe worth dying for. But I guess, obviously in the context of the film and the work he's doing in his mission, it's not acceptable. So, but again, because he does all this before we know he's a cop, initially we just think, oh, okay, it's not that big of a deal, I guess. It's just standard gangster criminal stuff. But then when he is, now it's like, oh wow, that I can't imagine how much it adds so much more dimension and layering to Tony as a character. So, and again, I think it's what makes the themes hit even harder. Imagine having to try to keep playing that role after killing so many people. It's obviously it would have to take an extreme emotional toll on the person who's doing that. And then that also hit the way that he is, the grappling with his conscience is something that is contrasted with Johnny Wong. Because remember, a lot of in a lot of Wu's films, like The Killer and A Better Tomorrow, even the criminals are looked to have a code of honor or something, a means to make, like something lines that they won't even cross. And Wong is one of the rare characters where, I guess there's a couple other ones, but at least in the context of this, Wong has none of that. He has no conscience. He has no sense of honor in any way. He's very calculated throughout most of the film because he doesn't stress about balancing, moral principles and ethics with his actions. Wong can do something completely, evil and nefarious, whether it's, setting up his boss and rival Hoy at the warehouse with no moral qualms about it, or when he, basically is like, when during the hospital scene, he basically says, I'll just blow up the hospital with everybody inside it. I don't care. I'll just, I'm going to do it because I'm going to do it. He's truly like a psychopath in that sense. And in that sense, it's weird in some warped way. It gives he has a certain freedom that, Wong has a certain freedom that Tequila and Tony just don't have. So, which again shows the true nature of the criminality element. So, and that actually might be one of the things between that describes that line between a cop and a criminal, because, the fact that the cop actually, at least the cops here mainly obviously have a sense of right and wrong that they try to follow, whereas Wong doesn't. But that's also challenged by his main kind of enforcer, his other main, like the secondary bad guy of the film, who's called Mad Dog, who, Mad Dog is, and I'll just say real quick though, Mad Dog is a cool character. He's an awesome character. Like, he doesn't say much. He's one of those he's a silent killer type, but the guy is unbelievable in this movie. Like, he's intimidating looking. He just has this, like, whereas Tony Leung, who plays Tony, he's supposed to be this kind of this crazy or he's supposed to be this killer, but he doesn't have that aggressive kind of brutal look to him. Whereas I think it's the actor's name was Philip Kwok, who played Mad Dog. And this guy was just tailor-made for this role. So, we see him, and every time we see him, we're like, this guy's about to do something. And he does. Every time. So, like, the first kind of major scene that we see him just go off is when in the warehouse scene where he comes in on a motorcycle, and he's got, I think it's an Uzi, and he's just spraying guys all over the place. He's going around, just, taking guys out left and right. And, he's throwing grenades in rooms. He's doing all this crazy stuff. I can't remember if he's the one, because there's a point when a guy on one of the motorcycles drives into a truck and basically runs over a guy. I can't remember if that's him or if that's somebody else. But Mad Dog, he goes through this. He's, again, he's incredibly brutal as a character, but we find out at the end during the hospital scene that he's not as cold and heartless and psychopathic, I guess, as Wong is, because he actually goes up to Wong and he says, why are we gonna kill the patients? They're not innocent. They didn't do anything wrong. So he goes up to Wong. He goes up to Wong and he says that, and Wong basically just brushes him off. And then during the actual battle in the hospital, Tony and Mad Dog, they have a standoff with each other. And then at one point they have to stop because there's a group of patients in between them. And then they both allow the patients to leave, where they kind of nod at each other. But Wong decides to he decides to take them all out. And this causes Mad Dog to basically rebel against him, and which, leads him to his own death where Wong just shoots him. And so it's like even Mad Dog, even the character that's like the crazy killer who, basically after gunning all these people down in the warehouse, he has a cigarette in his mouth and he leans over to get it lit by a fire that's going on one of the car hoods. And I mean, granted, that's a really cool looking shot, by the way. That's like an awesome looking shot, in my opinion. And he's like, so this guy doesn't even care. But the fact that even he has a line he doesn't cross, a threshold he doesn't go beyond, just shows how morally decrepit Johnny Wong's character is. So, and then I'd also say one of the other, I want to say, major themes of the film is loyalty, because it's represented on both the police and the gangster side. So you've got Tequila's loyalty to his partner, because that's what makes him, Tequila tells Pang that he's going to get Johnny Wong no matter what, and no one can stop him. And that stems from the fact that, that his partner was killed. And then you have, Tony's loyalty to Hoy, which is why it makes it, which is why it's so different, even though it's not, ultimately we find out it wasn't a real loyalty, but it was a loyalty, nonetheless. And then seemingly a loyalty to Wong, because we find out that Tony actually does probably respect Hoy in a way. Hoy isn't this murderous person the way that Wong is. And again, Hoy has this sense of right and wrong, even though he is a criminal. So that also contrasts between Johnny Wong as like the bad gangster and Uncle Hoy as the good gangster. And then there's even Tequila's loyalty to his informant, Foxy, because after Foxy gets injured or basically almost gets killed, Tequila is the one who takes him to the hospital and is there to help him out. I mean, maybe you can say he's doing that to protect his informant, but I'd like to think it's him acting because he knows that what Foxy did. So, and then like all of Woo's Hong Kong films, the central relationship between the two main characters is the backbone of the film. So the two main characters of the film are played by the recurring actors in John Woo's stable. Tequila, who is played by Woo's most prominent collaborator, Chow Yun-fat, with Hard Boiled marking their 5th time together. And actually, I didn't know, this is interesting. Woo was inspired to name the character Tequila because of William Holden's character in The Wild Bunch, who is drinking a bottle of tequila before the final fight. So I thought that was a cool little bit that I wanted to share. And then Tony is played by, legendary actor Tony Leung. But this is really, this is a lot earlier in his career. And this was actually his second film with Woo after he did Bullet in the Head with him. And I think one thing that Woo is able to do well over his films was have the main male relationship of the story be the focal point, but also find new ways to explore different dynamics. Because, for instance, in the Better Tomorrow films, the main dynamic is between two brothers, one who's a police officer and one who's a criminal, a gangster. And then in The Killer, it was between a hitman and a police detective. In a Bullet in the Head, it's between three brothers around the Vietnam War. So Woo found new ways to explore male brotherhood. And in this one, it's between two cops. But and Chow Yun-fat's Tequila is, I mean, he's the main lead of the film, and he's probably the more standout character in certain ways. Obviously, I think because Fat was probably the bigger star at the time. He was the more recognizable star. He had more, I think he just had he had a bigger presence overall. And his character, I just think just feels bigger in the film than Tony's character does. And I think that he just gets more moments in the film that make him look, again, larger than life. Just, the kind of ultimately, whether you want to call them heroic or not, but these star-making shots, the star shot, as it were, he gets more of those. So, at the end of the tea house shootout, I said how he kills the guy, but he doesn't just get to the guy. He rolls over a table. He's covered in flour. He lands right with the guy with his gun on the guy's forehead. And then pop, and then just goes. And then I think this is one of the coolest moments for his character is, before the warehouse battle, Tequila, he's getting ready and he's loading his shotgun, and he's just one at a time. He's putting one shell in at a time. He looks over, puts a shell in, looks back, looks over, puts another shell in. So, really just like, and things are about to go down as he's loading it. So it builds that anticipation. And I'll say that I think that Tequila is again probably the most complex character that he's done. I mean, he's definitely more chaotic and messier than John in The Killer. I mean, in The Killer, his character is complex as well, but he seems a little more in control of himself. His circumstances are more like he, as I said in that video, he's always kind of in control of things and having to react to things and everything. Whereas in this one, he's just, as I said, he's just he's a force of nature in this film. So, and we don't really know what he's going to be doing. So, but he does have these quieter moments too, where, for instance, there's a moment where Tequila's saying a prayer to, I think it's to a Buddha figure in the office to try to help with the problems of his life, most notably his love life with Teresa. So, and also like when he's introduced, when we see him first in the police station, he's trying to look for a place to live because he's having issues trying to just even find a place to live. So the guy is really just like, it's weird. He's down on his luck. And that's the thing, is like the job is the only thing he's got. That's the only thing basically that's kind of keeping him going. Again, that hard-boiled detective, that hard-boiled cop. Because Wu basically created Tequila to be the Hong Kong equivalent to Harry Callahan, to the Clint Eastwood character in Dirty Harry. He's a good cop who's unapologetically rough and, around the edges, and he does things to the beat of his own drum, regardless of the consequences or the fallout that might happen to it, or what might happen to him. So, and again, that makes him very fun to watch in the film. And then, while Tequila is the, more the loose cannon character, Tony is, again, he's the cooler, he's the more level-headed character of the two. And he's definitely the more psychologically compromised of the two characters, dealing with all this stuff and having to put on this front. Which I actually think, which is really interesting, because I learned on the audio commentary on the DVD, John Woo said that there was actually the character was initially written to just be this psychopathic character who goes around killing people, even like children. And he does these things, and again, but they changed him to be, and actually Tony Leung was on board as the character when it was still the raving crazy guy, but they changed it because they realized they changed it early in production to be that he's an undercover cop. So, and so that made his character a lot more, not, again, a lot more, give him a lot more positive attributes or redeemable. But the thing is again, he's a cool character. He's introduced while driving this kind of, hot red convertible with some cool jazz playing as he zips around on the highway, around Hong Kong. But he's also the more conflicted and haunted character of the two. So, because again, we don't know that Tony's a cop until halfway through, but, and that moment comes when at the end of the warehouse shootout, there's that, the classic moment of the Mexican standoff with the two characters pointing a gun at each other, where you have Tequila and Tony pointing a gun at each other. Tequila, pulls his trigger, but it doesn't fire. And then thinking that he's out of bullets. And then Tony basically uncocks his gun and pulls his gun away and spares him, which leads to Tequila confronting Pang later on, being like, hey, what just happened? Do you have is there a cop in this that I don't know about? And so, which then also leads to, after the warehouse fight, Tony's on his boat, and, we see him screaming out, just, I think, due to just the pure frustration and stress that he's under. So, which again shows how this is affecting him. And then also when he's on his boat, we see that he has this collection of origami cranes that are hanging everywhere. And then we find out in this kind of very morbid way that, because he tells this to Tequila, that every crane represents a person that he's killed. So, which again, I think he does to serve as a reminder, of what he's doing, and the fact that he maybe it's a way that he might not lose his complete soul about it, so that he remembers that each one is a life that he took. And the thing is, Tony, there's Tony talks about how he never intended to do undercover work, and that he just wanted to be a regular cop helping people. But unfortunately, that's not what happened to him. And he's also talking, and he basically also talks about how he can't wait. He set himself up to basically retire after this, because he says when he meets with Pang, he basically says, is everything set up for me when I'm done? Like a house in a different country. I'm out of this line of work. I'm done. So he's already ready to retire after this because of how hard it's been on him. And Tony is the character that literally represents the line between cop and criminal, because he has to walk that line every day. So, and you could say that Tequila and Tony represent two sides of the same coin. Both characters are essentially loners. They having to navigate the worlds ostensibly, surrounded by people, but ultimately they're alone. Alone. Tequila's alone because basically I don't want to say he pushes everybody away, but because he's so hard-headed and because he's so because of the way he is, it's just difficult for people to stay in his life. Whereas Tony has to kind of be on his own. He can't afford to have any contacts, any connections. For instance, if he had a family and he was undercover, what happens if the family gets found out and becomes liabilities, not potential hostages or victims for what he's doing? And I think, this sense of being alone is typified. Both of them, it's shown when, for instance, there's a moment when Tequila is fishing by himself. He's waiting to meet up with Foxy, but, he's alone. And then also we see Tony alone on his boat multiple times throughout the film. So, and here's the thing is, I feel like it's this solitary existence for both of them that allows them to connect with each other so well. So, because like other Wu films, the two men see each other as kindred spirits who represent these shared values and purposes. So, for instance, during the hospital finale, Tony accidentally kills a police officer, mirroring the fact that Tequila, shot a cop, at the tea house. And as they're going through after this happens, Tequila is trying to say, no, it's, you didn't do anything. It wasn't a cop. He's trying to convince him he didn't do this. And eventually, and Tony's like, no, I did it. I killed a police officer. And he's like, I think he says, like, I heard you did too. And he's like, yep. And he goes, how did you feel? He's like, worse than you do now. So again, that's a connection between the both of them. And that's the thing. And actually, so there's the scene where Tequila confronts Tony on his boat. And that's the first scene where they actually really get to talk to each other and connect to each other initially. So, and that's the start of their, I want to say the just like how in The Killer, John and Lee connect to each other, having conversations. This is where, Tequila and Tony do. And again, I also think, the loyalty element is what also serves as the fact that they both have a sense of loyalty. Tony does have a sense of honor to him that, again, it like when he has to shoot Uncle Hoy at the warehouse, Uncle Hoy actually says, like, kind of begs Tony to shoot him because Hoy says he would rather be, or basically says that he would rather be killed by somebody he respects than somebody who he doesn't, like Wong. And it's that kind of loyalty that they end up having, towards each other, or that Tequila and Tony have for each other by the end. And the film, hits this clear turning point though, once Tequila and Tony team up with each other. Because it feels like two disparate paths just coming together where both characters have been navigating alone, with arguably unsuccessful results. Although, I mean, Tony's still going, but we don't know how far he would have had to go. And so again, Tequila goes to meet Tony on his boat, and then they end up getting attacked and have to fight with each other. They have to get the guys that are trying to kill them. They have to come together and fight with each other. So, and that's a nice little, action scene there. And then this scene, cause it's the quintessential male bonding that Wu was known for. What's the better way for two guys to bond than to, shoot some bad guys? And then once they team up together, they both seem to be reinvigorated in their mission. Because Tequila and Tony go full partnership as they're trying to find the secret armory that's in the basement of the hospital. first by infiltrating the morgue, and then they find the armory in the basement, and then having the confrontation in Mad Dog in the armory after they're finally able to get the door open. And then they fight pretty much side by side through the hallways of the hospital. And then in the final standoff with Wong, he's holding Tony hostage, and Tequila basically has to, Wong is giving Tequila these commands to make sure that to say that, you need to do this so that I won't kill him. And and Tequila does it because he doesn't want to lose another partner. They have to work together to take Johnny Wong down. So now, and I think that the pairing of Chow Yun-fat and Tony Leung serves as a fitting testament to Hard Boiled, because they are arguably the most successful actors to emerge from Woo's Hong Kong period. Almost as if Woo was saving his most spectacular film for last. So Hard Boiled is generally seen as Woo's crowning achievement in action cinema. So, it capped off this meteoric rise in Hong Kong. And the film kind of serves as the final epic chapter for his three masterpieces, with The Killer and Bullet in the Head. So, it's because each film got progressively larger and more ambitious, similar to Sergio Leone's Man with No Name trilogy. So, which, went from a fistful of dollars to, for a few dollars more, to The Good and the Bad and the Ugly. And, Hard Boiled is probably the largest canvas Woo had to work with in his Hong Kong period. And he takes advantage of it in every way. Woo has described himself as a filmmaker that does what he likes, what he wants to see, without concerning himself about, anything else, really. So, and I know other filmmakers might be like that as well, but I feel like in this situation, because Woo, the result is, again, just this magnificent action. So, because he makes his action look fantastical, because that's how he wants it to be. And he said, he finds realism very boring. So, and it's funny because Woo is actually in the film as well. He plays a friend to Tequila who used to be a cop, but now is this bartender. He kind of serves as a mentor to Tequila's character in the film. And Woo did the role because it was the last day, of shooting. They had no one to play the character, and Chow Yun-fat had actually been trying to get to be in a scene with Woo because of their friendship. So it just ended up working out there. And Woo actually had a role in A Better Tomorrow 2 as well as another cop, but he and Fat didn't get to share a scene together in that film. So, and while the film might have fewer major action sequences, say, than The Killer does, they're much larger in scale and scope, and they get progressively larger as the film progresses. So, and what Woo does incredibly well for all three sequences is how he builds the anticipation. So he doesn't just jump right into the action, but again, like a symphony, he lets the tension grow and build and increase until it explodes. So the first major action scene is in the tea house confrontation in the beginning. So the tea house shootout serves as kind of your standard Woo action intro, where you have a gunfight in pretty much a relatively tight enclosed space, kind of similar to the church shootout at the end of The Killer, or the mansion battle at the end of A Better Tomorrow 2. So, the scene begins with many characters having these bird cages, where Tequila walks in with, holding a bird cage. And I'm not exactly sure why. I don't know if this was like a bird tea house, but there's bird cages everywhere in the tea house. And then the scene kind of channels like a Sergio Leone, where it keeps cutting between Tequila and the criminals he's watching. So that was a way that Leone would build kind of the lead up to his shootouts. But it's not a straight homage to Leone, since Woo doesn't do like the tight facial close-ups that Leone did, but he raises the anticipation in the same way. So, and then, while the tea house shootout is kind of prime vintage Wu, it's the dock warehouse scene that shows you Wu has really upped his game. Because this is also the major first section of the film that actually contains multiple action sequences. So it's actually split into multiple parts. So the first part is the incursion of Wong's forces into the warehouse, where which is then slowed down to afterwards, where they're basically taking the stuff out of the warehouse, but then it's also setting up for Uncle Hoy to get there with his men and to set up for that confrontation and ultimately execution. And it's actually this quiet period in between that allows for for the action sequences to breathe and kind of have their own moments, which I like, because it gives you it gives you some decompression a little bit. And then it finally finishes with Tequila dropping in and doing the one-man attack at the very end. So, but then Wu also creates the rising of tension in the scene by, he follows Wu Wong's men as they're going to the warehouse. It's led by this phalanx of motorcycles that are leading there. And it's by giving us this sufficient time to follow the bikes as they're riding through to the docks. It allows us to know, that something is about to go down. And that gets us excited. It's similar, for instance, to like the SUV ambush in Clear and Present Danger or the bank shootout in Point Break. So, and I'd say the warehouse sequence is also where the spectacle of Wu's action starts to be much, much larger, bigger than anything else he had done. So, because, when the bikes enter, they start shooting everyone, and we see multiple explosions throughout the building. Characters falling all over the place, jumping all over the place. And then the entire the biggest sequence of his entire filmography of that point is the third act of the film, which is all in the hospital. It's his largest and his most spectacular set piece. So, and just like the other major action sequences, the hospital finale has this clear progression to how it goes. So, it starts out with, when Tequila and Tony, they find the armory, when Wong, which sets Wong off to essentially want to kill everyone and blow up the hospital. Which that also introduces, with the explosion, with the bombs, it introduces a ticking clock element to the finale. And so, and then you have, Teresa and Pang when they start to evacuate the hospital patients, when Wong's men are holding, the people hostage, and the police show up outside, when Tequila and Tony are gearing up to go into that final fight. And then essentially once the action starts, it just keeps escalating and escalating as the whole sequence progresses. Like, we see Wong's men, start firing on the police outside, blowing up cop cars, followed by, Tequila and Tony going through their kind of blitzkrieg through the hospital hallways, which is cool, because there's actually one sequence in the film, which is, I think, like about 2.5 to 3 minutes maybe, where it's just one unbroken shot. Which I think is really cool, because it essentially, like, it starts going through the hospital, and then it stops it's one moment when Tony shoots the police officer, and then they get into an elevator. The elevator, I assume, goes to a different level, and then they get off on another level, and and it's all unbroken. So, which is great. And then obviously the big finale is when the whole hospital blows up. So it really, like, Wu knew what he was doing, just the way that he was able to build everything as the hospital finale is going. And I thought something that was really cool that I learned is that Wu used an old Coca-Cola plant for the major, location of both the warehouse and the hospital, so that this plant served as both locations. Which I thought was really interesting. And I mean, hey, it's a great use, and that's something that I really appreciate, the fact that's to me, that's creative filmmaking. So, and because of the larger nature of the action sequences, by this point, Woo used a lot more wide angle lenses than he had in previous films, I think, in order to capture the full range of the spectacle. So like many of the shots during the warehouse sequences utilize wide angle lenses. And then you also have, Woo's trademark of just this visual dynamism that's just where there's a lot happening. There's a lot of moving elements in several shots during the action scenes. So for instance, in one shot, there can be explosions, motorcycles riding through, people running around and shooting all at the same time. So as well as some scenes during the hospital sequence where you have the police on the ground and other characters running around, fires happening and all this stuff. So just a lot of stuff happening that he's capturing that we're really able to take in, and is pretty fantastic. And I mean, the action sequences in the film are so big and elaborate that I had to leave so much out, because otherwise this episode would be much longer. I'm struggling to kind of keep it in line as it is, just because there's so much to talk about. I mean, that's why I feel like watching this movie, and I'm sure a lot of people who are watching this have probably seen it, but you watch it again and it's so sumptuous as a film. So, and I think I feel like the entire film can be almost seen as this grand finale for Woo's Hong Kong career, because, it would be after Hard Boiled that he would make his transition to Hollywood the next year. So a film like Hard Boiled really stands out to me today because, one of the major, for one major reason, and which is because it's the kind of film that I just feel like doesn't really exist anymore. Hard Boiled is a big original action film. It's not based on any pre-existing material. That was, and even more impressively, was made using 100% practical effects and stunts. It's the kind of film that was ubiquitous in the 80s and the 90s, but basically became virtually extinct once CGI and franchise films became dominant in at least in Hollywood, but throughout most of the world eventually as well. Because when I watch Hard Boiled, I really appreciate everything about how it was made. How Woo was able to craft and choreograph each major action set piece. The fact that all the pyrotechnics and on-set effects had to work. They couldn't, there was no digital effects to be added later or cleaned up in post-production. Like, an explosion or stunt was rigged to look a certain way, and it had to be captured on film. So, and it's like, that's it. And oftentimes, because major stunts or pyrotechnics like that would only have one shot to get it right. So, and that's the thing. So knowing that, you're just thinking to yourself, the fact that that seems so crazy to, I'm sure, to people today, this idea that, because so many things now are done on computers in films that you can control it, you can change it, you can do whatever you want to however it looks. Whereas back then, they didn't know how an explosion was going to look. They didn't know exactly how a stunt was going to look. Was it going to look okay? Tequila's character or the stuntman who plays his character, or who's playing him, jumps out the window, like, how many times did they have to do that? Like, and how did it look? Like, and the thing is, because real stunts are able to impress you in ways that I feel like computer enhanced visuals just can't, because, so much credit to all the stunt performers, in the world and, in films like this, because real stunts, they add this layer of tension in us, because when we watch them, we know it, we see that it's a real person doing something dangerous. So we know that it's, like when we see Tequila, and I think it's actually him. I think it's actually Chow Yun-fat doing this. And so even the actors too, running through the hallways as the hallways are exploding around him. we know that's a real person doing that. So I feel like that makes us kind of hold our breath more and kind of gets us more like, oh man, that's crazy. So again, because of that though, that's why I love this film. That's why I love a lot of these older John Woo films, because again, you see the action and I feel like they still have the ability to blow you away because they're real, because they're all real. And that's something that we just don't get as much in the same way. I mean, again, some films will do that. And I mentioned this in The Killer too, that like Mad Max Fury Road is one of those films that had predominantly real stuff. And a lot of the stunt work was real, but they still had a lot of CG in there too. Not as much as like a Marvel movie, but still a good amount. But I feel like when you watch a film like Hard Boiled, it shows you, I think, how incredible action films used to be in a different way. So now regarding the movie itself, I think that this is John Woo's undisputed masterpiece and his best film. I know a lot of people are probably going to argue with me and they'll say either The Killer or Bullet in the Head. I would say in the comments below, let me know what your favorite John Woo film from this period is. I mean, maybe you think his best films are something, maybe might be one of his Hollywood movies, but I'd say if narrowing it down to his Hong Kong films, what do you think is best? And I think there are definitive arguments you can make for movies like The Killer or Bullet in the Head, but I personally think that Hard Boiled is Woo's best. Because, while The Killer and Bullet in the Head are more personal focused stories, Hard Boiled, it's a pure, like, entertaining action, just extravaganza. So the film doesn't grapple with as much complex moral themes as his other films do. So the characters, and the stakes are a little easier to process. We can understand Tequila and his motivations much more clearly. We know who the good guys are. We know who the bad guys are for the most part, obviously Tony being an exception. But we understand the nature of his obsession, why he can't let the case go. I mean, and there were a lot of people, and there were people that said that Hard Boiled was Woo's most American film of his Hong Kong films. So I don't know if I necessarily agree with that or not. I don't know if you would agree with that or not. Maybe because I don't know if that's because the film is a little more morally unambiguous than some of his other films are. I don't know if I don't necessarily agree that Hollywood films are all like black and white when it comes to their morality or their sense of morality. I think a lot of films in Hollywood aren't that way. But again, that's how I see it. You might not agree. But again, regardless of whether it is his most Americanized film or not, I do think that Hard Boiled is his best film overall. But yeah, and it's and again, going back to like the framework of just, again, the fact that, and I get that many people prefer, complexity and things to be more morally gray. So like, again, I think a lot of people might think that Tony's the better character in the film because he is the more conflicted character, and he does have to grapple and debate within himself what he's doing. But I think for the sake of the film, sometimes that can bog down a story or make it potentially less enjoyable because it's more about arguing the principles or right and wrong. And that's probably why, what I think, why Hard Boiled is just his kind of purely his most entertaining film. So, and I'd say objectively, it's one of the best action movies of the 90s for sure. I don't know if I would put it in the best action movies of all time. I'd say it might be in like a top 20 list of it. I don't know if it'd be top 10, maybe. I really don't like lists though, because I think lists are very arbitrary and subjective. So what I might list as the best films or best action films, other people will find completely different. So I don't like to do that. I just like to be like, this is a fantastic film. This is a wonderful film. I just like to do that, and no particular order. So if I would list things, I would probably just do it maybe like alphabetically or chronologically based on the year they came out. So, and I think, and I think his Hollywood, and I think Woo's Hollywood tenure yielded some really great, some really fun and enjoyable movies. But Hard Boiled was was his masterpiece. It was the culmination of everything he had done in Hong Kong up to that point. So, and now Wu would actually go back to China to make a terrific, period action epic called Red Cliff, which I also love. But at that point, it wasn't. But at that point, Hong Kong cinema, it had been forever changed. So it wasn't the same as his Hong Kong films. And Hard Boiled, it brought together everything signature about him to produce his best results. And I think that the hospital finale is one of the greatest action sequences of all time. So, because the scene just has so many moving parts, from the actors to the effects to the way the camera moves to capture everything clearly. And again, like The Killer, Wu was just brilliant at creating these incredibly dynamic and complex action scenes that were never confusing or disorienting to follow. So, and I never get tired of watching action movies like this, because they still impress me, to this day. So again, as I said, I can't say enough good things about it. Now, regarding how you can watch the film, it's basically identical to The Killer. So it's also been out of print from Criterion for many years. So unfortunately, you can only, the only place you can find copies are on eBay. And now, luckily, the Criterion DVD of Hard Boiled can go for somewhat cheaper prices than The Killer did. So, I said how The Killer usually goes from between about $100 to $300 for a new copy. But with Hard Boiled, you're probably still going to have to pay at least $100 for it. And then there's also the Dragon Dynasty DVD version that is considerably cheaper than the Criterion version. So here, I'll hold up. Here's the Criterion cover one more time for Hard Boiled right there for you. And then also like the Killer, there's the newer 4K Blu-ray releases that, one that's available from Shout Factory. That's the one in the US. And then there's one from Arrow that's available in the UK. And then you can also watch Hard Boiled on many streaming services, most notably the Criterion Channel, along with several other options like Tubi or Sling, as well as being able, obviously, to buy them on places like Amazon or Apple. So I want to say thank you again for joining me on the Criterion Chronicle. I hope you enjoyed it, and stay tuned for what's coming up next on the next episode. Up next on the Criterion Chronicle is Spine number 10, Nicholas Roeg's beautiful and haunting Australian coming-of-age tale, Walkabout. So, if you want to continue on this journey with me through the Criterion Collection, then make sure that you subscribe and hit the notification bell so that you can follow along and not miss one of these amazing films. Take care, and I hope to see you next time.